I am Larry Hatcher. This is Psych 100, General Psychology. And this lecture is going to be Chapter 7, Memory. I'll be lecturing on my lecture notes that are headed Chapter 1, or rather Chapter 7, Module 1, Memory. Our outline will begin with the three-part memory system, which divides memory into sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. I'll say a few things about some theories of forgetting. That's likely to be about as far as we get in this part of the lecture. In a later lecture, I'll pick up with the topics of encoding and miscellaneous topics in memory. So, in my lecture notes that are headed Chapter 7, Module 1, Memory, let's go to page 2. My first topic is going to be the memory system, the three-part memory system that's covered in just about all general psychology textbooks. We'll talk about the differences between sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. I'll give you a heads up. One of the things that I want you to be familiar with is the primary differences between these three memory systems. We're going to see that one of the primary differences is how long information remains in one of the memory systems. Let's begin with the most primitive memory system, sensory memory, also referred to as sensory registers. Definition for sensory memory. It's a process which allows the effect of a stimulus to persist in the memory system for a very brief time after the stimulus has been removed. What do you mean very brief time? Let's say up to 3 seconds, but it depends on which sense we're discussing. I'll give you an example of sensory memory. Imagine that it is back in early in the evolution of human beings. We are a relatively primitive creature that lives via hunting and gathering. Today we're out hunting. Imagine that we're in a forested area. There's an empty trail that lies before us. Let's say it extends for 100 yards. And there's heavy forest on the left side and the right side of this trail. In the distance, we see an animal runs across the trail, disappears from one side of the forest into the other. The physical image of that animal is present in the environment for just 1/1000th of a second. 1/1000th of a second is not long enough for our brains to decide what that animal was. Was it an antelope that we should be pursuing, or was it a saber-toothed tiger that we should be running away from? Unfortunately, the image was only there for 1/1000th of a second, and that wasn't long enough for us to figure out what it was. Fortunately for us, however, we have sensory memory. And with respect to the visual system, the image of that animal, even though it was only physically present for 1/1000th of a second, our brain kept that image active for a little bit longer. Our brain kept that active for about 1/4 of a second. What we're making use of in this case is the visual sensory memory, and a piece of information that's kept active in the visual sensory memory is called an icon. In visual sensory memory, the information remains for about 1/4 of a second and then fades after 1/4 of a second. Now, this sensory memory, this icon being there for 1/4 of a second, that's a lot longer than 1/1000th of a second. And 1/4 of a second was long enough for us to decide that was an antelope. That's something that I need to pursue. So the image was physically present for just 1/1000th of a second, but the icon was available in our visual sensory memory for a longer period of time, 1/4 of a second, long enough for us to decide what it was. So the information, if it remains active in visual sensory memory, we call it an icon, and we use different terms if it's instead in auditory sensory memory. Information that remains active briefly in auditory sensory memory is called an echo, and echoes last a little longer than icons. Echoes will fade in several seconds, let's say 2 or 3 seconds. Give you an example of an echo in auditory sensory memory. You're at a party, engaged in conversation with someone. You're not paying attention to the people around you. You don't notice that standing behind you is your roommate, and your roommate is asking you a question. You're not paying attention. You don't really hear that question until you hear your name at the end of it. And at the end of the question, you stop, you think about it, and you recognize that what my roommate just asked me was, "Where did you put my cell phone, Larry?" Now, you weren't paying attention until you heard your name, but when you did hear your name, you're able to play back the question. How could that be? How could you play back something that's not physically in the environment anymore? Because it's still active in sensory memory. It's still active in your auditory sensory memory. What you were playing back was an echo. Echoes last a little bit longer than icons. Echoes will fade after 2 or 3 seconds. We have sensory memory. Why do we have it? We theoretically could have evolved without anything like sensory memory, and yet we do have it. How come? Well, a lot of the features that we have in our nervous system and our brain, in our senses, we have it because it increased the probability of survival. Eons ago, there were some creatures that had sensory memory and some that did not. The ones that had sensory memory were more likely to live long enough to pass their genes into the next generation. And the consequence is, for us today, we have sensory memory because it served our ancestors so well. So, we're talking about the three-part memory system, which we divide into sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. We've discussed sensory memory. Let's now move forward to short-term memory. In my lecture notes, this picks up on page 3, about halfway down page 3 in my lecture notes. Short-term memory, which we'll abbreviate STM. We can define it as memory for learned material over a brief retention interval. What do I mean brief retention interval? 15 to 20 seconds. Notice information lasts longer in short-term memory than in sensory memory. In short-term memory, it lasts about 15 to 20 seconds. In a minute, we'll see that if information enters your short-term memory, but you don't do something to turn it into a permanent memory, and if you're distracted, not allowed to rehearse the information, that information will disappear from short-term memory and does so pretty quickly. It disappears in about 15 to 20 seconds. So one way to think about short-term memory, memory for learned material over a brief retention interval of, let's say, 15 to 20 seconds. Here's another way to think about short-term memory. Short-term memory is the same thing as consciousness. Short-term memory contains the information that you're conscious of at a given moment in time. Right now, if you're paying attention to my lecture, then my lecture is filling your short-term memory. If instead you're paying attention to something on your cell phone, then what's on your cell phone is filling your short-term memory. 3 o'clock in the morning this morning, you'll be having a dream, and your dream will be filling short-term memory. Short-term memory is consciousness. Short-term memory is where you live your life. I'm going to draw some distinctions between short-term memory versus long-term memory. One of the distinctions between short-term versus long-term memory, as the name would suggest, is that information does not last terribly long in short-term memory. If you get information into short-term memory, but you don't do something to get it into long-term memory, it disappears. Information that only enters short-term memory is not permanent. It lasts only for about 15 to 20 seconds unless it's rehearsed in some way. Rehearsal can mean different things in this context. Let's think of rehearsal as repeating the information to yourself again and again. Why does information disappear from short-term memory so quickly? There's more than one factor that can contribute to forgetting from short-term memory. And one of the types of forgetting that influences short-term memory is decay. Decay theory, which is all about this process of information disappearing from short-term memory, decay theory says that the passage of time itself can cause a memory trace to disappear from short-term memory. Decay theory says the passage of time alone can make the information fade. A minute ago, we said that information fades in about 15 to 20 seconds. And if you're not doing anything to rehearse that information, the information will decay and go away. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that information decays? And furthermore, how do we know that it decays so quickly in 15 to 20 seconds? Our strongest evidence comes from a type of investigation called a distractor study. Distractor studies are very popular in memory research, and talking about how a distractor study is conducted will help you understand what I mean by rehearsal and help you understand what I mean by information fading if it's not rehearsed. Here's an example of a typical stimulus used in a distractor study. Imagine this. You've signed up for an investigation. After you complete the paperwork, the researcher asks you to focus your attention on a computer screen in this general vicinity of the computer screen. The researcher says, I'm going to show you a nonsense word in that location. I'm going to show it to you for just 4 seconds, and then I'm going to take it away. You're going to sit there quietly for 40 seconds when there's nothing on the screen. And at the end of the 40 seconds, I'm going to ask you to write down that nonsense word if you can. Nonsense word is just a jumble of letters and numbers that does not mean anything. So this is the way the procedure goes in your case. Look at this location on the screen. Very briefly, I show you this stimulus. There's your nonsense word. You look at it for 4 seconds, and then I take it away. Now, in the case of my students, I didn't really take it away because you know that the nonsense word is still there, and you could scroll up and look at it. But let's imagine that you are instead a subject in this investigation. I've taken it away. You're looking at a blank screen. You sit there quietly for 40 seconds. And at the end of the 40 seconds, I tell you, okay, write down the nonsense word if you can. And so you think about it, you write down the nonsense word, and then we have you check whether you did it correctly or not. And there's the nonsense word. I've done this in the past in my own classes, back when I didn't give the notes to my students so they didn't have the nonsense word in front of them available just if they scroll to it. And when I would do this in the past with my general psychology classes, I would typically find, I would show them the correct word, I'd have them check their work, and I would ask, okay, how many of you got it right? How many of you remembered the nonsense word? And usually like 90% of the students would stick their hand up. Well, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen. I said that information disappears from short-term memory in 15 to 20 seconds, and yet when I do this procedure with my students, they were able to recall the information after a long period of time, 40 seconds. I would ask somebody, well, how did you do this? How were you able to remember this word? Usually they would say, well, I just said it to myself after you took it away from the screen. I said to myself, NT2VL5J, NT2VL5J. I said it to myself many times. This is rehearsal. One form of rehearsal is rote rehearsal, when you simply say the term to yourself again and again without changing it in any way. And as long as you're rehearsing this information, saying it to yourself again and again, you can keep it active in short-term memory not only for 40 seconds, but you can keep it active for 5 minutes or longer. Now, the problem with that version of the procedure was I allowed you to rehearse the information. I allowed you to use rote rehearsal. And as long as you're doing this rote rehearsal, you'll be able to keep that information in short-term memory for a long period of time. But what if I prevented you from doing that rehearsal? What if I distracted you? So we go to the second trial of my demonstration. And I'll describe this as if you were students in my class back years ago when I had control of the information and they didn't have it on their files on their computers. I said, okay, once again, I want you to look in this location. In a minute, I'm going to show you a different nonsense word. It'll be a different jumble of letters and numbers, doesn't mean anything. I'm going to show it to you for 4 seconds, and then I'm going to take it away so you can't see it. And you're going to sit there for 40 seconds with it not on the screen. But this time, I'm going to have you do something during that 40-second period. During that 40-second period, I want you to begin with the number 171, and I want you to count backwards by threes. I would actually have everybody in the class do this out loud. Out loud, they would say 171, 168, and so forth. So let's imagine that we're actually doing this with my class. Look in this location. I'm going to show you a new nonsense word. Here's your nonsense word. Show it to you for 4 seconds. And then I take it away. Okay, everybody. You start with the number 171, count backwards by threes. And everybody would say 171, 168, 165, 162, and so forth. And I would actually time it. And at the end of the 40-second period, I would say, okay, now write down that nonsense word if you can. And when I ask that, there's usually nervous laughter, and they would struggle, and I'd give them a few seconds to write it down. And once they had time to do it, I'd let them check their work, and here's your work. Here's the nonsense word that I showed you the second time. Now, how many were able to retrieve that information? And on the second trial, very few students were able to remember it. 90% of the students were not able to remember it. This is what we mean by a distractor study. Distractor study is the kind of procedure that gives us the strongest evidence supporting decay theory. The passage of time by itself is enough to cause information to disappear from short-term memory, and it does so quickly. The distractor study that I described here was kind of crude. When you do it under tightly controlled conditions, you usually find that most people do lose that information after 15 or 20 seconds. Now, I said that when I do this trial the second time with the distractor study, 90% of the people aren't able to remember the information, but a small percentage typically could. In my classes, usually 5%, maybe 10% of the people could retrieve it. And those folks, what was their trick? It's possible that some of them had what researchers call eidetic imagery, what lay people call photographic memory. There are some folks that can look at an image, and even if they're being distracted, they can later go back and retrieve that image because they have a photographic image of it in their brain. Eidetic imagery, relatively rare, but not non-existent, and that may be what was helping some of my students retrieve the information. Most people could not. Most people gave us the evidence that we see with typical research subject, which shows that information usually lasts in short-term memory for only a short period of time, usually lasts only 15 to 20 seconds, and then it decays unless I allow you to rehearse it. So we're talking about short-term memory. Where's my definition? Here it is. Short-term memory. Memory for learned material over a brief retention interval, say 15 to 20 seconds. I want you to be familiar with the distinctions between short-term memory versus long-term memory. We've already seen one of them. In short-term memory, information disappears quickly. Information doesn't last very long. Here's the second distinction between short-term memory versus long-term memory. And we haven't gotten to long-term memory yet, but it's coming. Another characteristic of short-term memory is this. Short-term memory has limited capacity. One of the things that distinguishes short-term memory from long-term memory is you can't keep very much information in short-term memory. Think of it as a cup that does not hold very much liquid. I'll give you one example of what I mean by limited capacity of short-term memory. What if I asked you to do two things at the same time? What if I said, I want you in your mind to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to yourself? Do so quietly, do it mentally in your mind. And at the same time that you're reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to yourself, I want you to go over your multiplication tables that you learned in elementary school. I want you to say to yourself, 2 times 2 is equal to 4, 2 times 3 is equal to 6, 2 times 4 is equal to 8, and so forth. I want you to do this both simultaneously. But your response would be, well, I can't do that. I can't do two things at the same time. I can't say the Pledge of Allegiance and at the same time do my multiplication tables. That's because you recognize that short-term memory has limited capacity. There's only so many things we can hold in short-term memory at one point in time. Well, what exactly is the capacity of short-term memory? Standard answer that psychologists give us is the capacity of short-term memory is about 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. What's a bit of information? Think of it as the smallest possible piece of information. For example, a good analogy for a bit of information is a digit like 7. It's not a perfect metaphor. A bit of information is actually more simple than the digit 7, but that's the closest analogy that we can use to communicate the idea. A typical person can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information in short-term memory at a given point in time. What do you mean 7 plus or minus 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information? Well, 7 minus 2 is 5. Some people can only keep about 5 bits of information in short-term memory at a time. 7 plus 2 is 9. This reflects the fact that some people can keep more. Some people can keep 9 bits of information in short-term memory at a point in time. There's variability across people, and there's also variability within people. When you're on a really sharp day, you can keep 9 bits. If you're not doing so well today, maybe you can only keep 5. So this is what we mean by the limited capacity of short-term memory. It is a cup that does not hold very much information. Now, if we were totally limited by that limited capacity, we human beings would have great trouble functioning in our environment. We would be like a computer that has hardly any RAM at all. Lucky for us, we human beings are clever, and we have come up with tricks to increase the efficiency of short-term memory, to get the most out of short-term memory we possibly can. We can increase our efficiency by using tricks like grouping bits of information into chunks. A chunk is a unit of immediate memory which might contain many bits of information. One of the tricks we human beings use to get the most we can out of short-term memory is dividing bits of information into chunks. Unit of immediate memory that contains many bits. This process of chunking is the process of grouping information into meaningful units for easier handling by short-term memory. Now, this might sound kind of technical, the grouping of information into meaningful units for easier handling short-term memory. It's something that you do every day, and you've been doing it for so long that you don't pay any attention to the process of chunking. Here's an example of a relatively difficult cognitive task for a human being and how we use chunking to make it an easier task. Imagine that I gave you a 10-digit sequence that I wanted you to remember an hour from now. 10-digit sequence is 98996473441. Now that's 10 digits, and that's in the upper ends of the capacity of short-term memory. That's near the upper limits of the pieces of information the typical human can hold in short-term memory. So that's going to be a challenging task. Except if you're a student in my class, you're going to look at that sequence and realize, well, that's not a challenging task because it's not really 10 different bits of information. This is a telephone number. If you're a student in my class, you recognize that the first 3 digits, well, that's the area code. Most phone numbers in this part of Michigan begin with an area code of 989. The next 3 digits, that's the local exchange. Most phone numbers here on the campus of Saginaw Valley State University have 964 as the exchange. The only thing you really need to remember are the last 4 digits, the 7341. And if you've got a really good memory, you've seen this number before. This is my office phone number. So you're not going to view this as 10 bits of information that you've got to work with. You're going to view this as 3 chunks of information. You divide these numbers into one chunk, divide these into one chunk, and divide these into one chunk. Now, you don't have 10 pieces of information to deal with, you have just 3 chunks to deal with. You use shortcuts like this every day to make the most that you can out of short-term memory. Short-term memory has limited capacity, but we human beings are clever and we've come up with all kinds of hacks to get the most out of short-term memory we can. Chunking is an example of one of those hacks. So I said there's a 3-part memory system. Information lasts the least amount of time in sensory memory, 2 or 3 seconds at the most. Information lasts a little bit longer in our second memory system, short-term memory. There, 15 or 20 seconds if I don't allow you to rehearse it. And finally, we come to the third part of our memory system, where information lasts the longest. As the name would suggest, it's long-term memory where information lasts the longest. Long-term memory, or LTM. Definition for long-term memory. It's that portion of memory that is more or less permanent. If you successfully get information into long-term memory, it may be permanent information. You may be able to retrieve that information hours from now, days from now, even years from now. Yes, that's my next note. If you successfully get information into long-term memory, it may last minutes, years, or even decades. My mother, who passed away a few years ago, had good memory and her mind was sharp right up to the end of her life. I remember talking to her not terribly long before she passed away. She was in her early 90s when we had this conversation. And she was talking about something that happened to her that when she was a child that she still remembered. When she was a very little girl, she had a birthday coming up, and she told her parents that for her birthday present, she wanted a toy baby carriage. And her birthday was approaching, and she was clever enough to realize there's a good chance that mom and dad have already bought this baby carriage for me. So she did some snooping around, and sure enough, hidden away in the back of a closet, she found this toy baby carriage that they did, in fact, give to her a couple of days later on her birthday. Now, this had happened like 90 years previously, and yet she was able to recall that experience. That's because she successfully got it into long-term memory, that portion of memory that's more or less permanent. So one way to think about long-term memory is the portion of memory that information could last minutes, years, or even decades. Here's another way to think about long-term memory. Long-term memory contains everything that you know. If you know who the President of the United States is right now, that's because that information is in long-term memory. If you know what the interest rate is on business transactions in the state of Michigan, it's because that piece of information is in long-term memory. If you know what color the couch is in your mother's living room, it's because that information is in long-term memory. It's everything that you know. One of the nice things about long-term memory, and one of the things that distinguishes it from short-term memory, is long-term memory's capacity is essentially limitless. No matter how much information you got into long-term memory, you can still get more information in there. Once again, talking about elderly relatives, my father-in-law, who also passed away a few years ago, late in his life, he decided that he was going to travel to Germany, and he wanted to be able to speak German to the people that he met there. So he actually bought a couple of books on how to speak German. He spent some time studying, and sure enough, he learned enough German that he was able to get around in Germany, asking questions and answering questions and having simple conversations. Although he had over 80 years worth of information in long-term memory, he was still able to get more information into it. Its capacity is, for all practical purposes, limitless. So that is something that distinguishes long-term memory from short-term memory. Has much greater capacity. At this point in class, I show my class a video called What Happens When You Remove the Hippocampus. Let me set this up. This is a short video that focuses on a famous case study in memory research. A case study of an individual who for years was just known by his initials HM. I like to show this video because it shows the role that individual case studies can play in science. I like to show it because it illustrates the difference between different types of memory. The fact that we are capable of declarative memory, and the video talks about what that is. We're also capable of a different kind of memory, procedural memory, and the video talks about that. As is the case with all of my videos, there's two questions I want you to have in mind as you watch it. Both of them are going to be fill in the blank questions, and for each of them, I tell you what the terms are to be filled in. Your job is just to decide which terms go in which slot. For the first question, the terms are going to be long-term memory versus short-term memory. Statement one. If given a number, HM could repeat it to himself for 15 minutes. This meant that he still had pretty good blank memory. So what was that, long-term memory or short-term memory? But we're still talking about HM. Minutes later, HM forgot he'd even participated in this task. This meant that he had pretty poor what? And again, it'll be either long-term memory or short-term memory. Question two. The answers are going to be declarative memory versus procedural memory. HM could still ride a bicycle and sign his name after the injury that produced his memory issues. He could still ride a bicycle and sign his name. This meant he still had pretty good blank memory. What goes there, declarative or procedural? But HM had difficulty memorizing new names, new dates, or facts. This meant he had relatively poor blank memory. What goes there, declarative or procedural? Have those questions in mind as you watch the video. Here's the link to the video. You can control click it. And it'll take you right to the video that's in YouTube. It's 5 minutes in length. If you're a student in my class, I want you to go ahead and click this link, watch the video, and then ponder the answers to the questions. I'll talk about the answers to the questions afterward. But right now, watch the video. Let's assume you have watched the video. In watching it, you would have picked up the following answers to the two questions that I posed related to it. The first dealt with long-term memory versus short-term memory. If given a number, HM could repeat it to himself for 15 minutes. This meant he still had pretty good short-term memory. If you can keep something active for a period of time by rehearsing it, by repeating it to yourself, you're making use of short-term memory. But HM, minutes later, forgot that he had even participated in this task. This meant he had relatively poor long-term memory. If an hour later I asked HM, do you remember the task we were doing earlier today, the task that involved a number? What was the number that I gave you to repeat to yourself? Not only would he not be able to remember what the number was, he might deny that he ever did such a number memory task earlier today. That's because he was unable to get the information into long-term memory in such a way that he could retrieve it. Second question dealt with declarative versus procedural memory. After the injury that caused memory problems for him, HM could still ride a bicycle and he could still sign his name. This meant he still had pretty good procedural memory. So he could still do things. Presumably, his memory for how to do things like ride a bicycle were distributed across parts of his brain that had not been damaged in the injury that they described in the video. However, after his injury, HM had difficulty memorizing new names, new dates, or facts. If you gave him a textbook and encouraged him to learn about uh, Sigmund Freud and memorize 5 facts about Sigmund Freud, and 2 hours later you asked him about it, chances are good he would not have anything to say about Sigmund Freud. He would not have memorized any facts. That was because he had relatively poor declarative memory after his injury. Obviously, declarative memory is the type of memory. It's very important when you're taking college class like general psychology. Much of your grade depends on your ability to get the information into declarative memory in such a way that you could retrieve that information. Some theories of forgetting. If we're going to study memory and how it works and how it can be successful in encoding information in such a way that we can retrieve it when we need it, we need to know something about forgetting. We need to know something about the forces that make it difficult for us to retrieve the information when we need it. It turns out that after many decades of research, most researchers in this area agree that there isn't just one force that causes forgetting. It's not the case that all forgetting is due to interference. It's not the case that all forgetting is due to decay. It turns out there are multiple forces that contribute to forgetting. I'm going to discuss two prominent theories of forgetting here: reconstructed memory and interference. Forgetting is caused by multiple factors, not just one. I'm going to focus on two contributors to forgetting: reconstructed memory and interference. And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list of the forces that contribute to forgetting. You're going to learn about additional factors that lead to forgetting and when you read Ettinger. Here I'll talk about two. I'll introduce two. First up, reconstructed memory. This is maybe the more interesting of the two factors that lead to forgetting. Reconstructed memory is a memory that's been changed or distorted so that it's no longer an accurate record of the original event. Think about it this way. We, as normal human beings, very often think of our memory as being like a videotape. If I ask you, do you remember what happened at your most recent birthday party? You think about it, and you can play back that birthday party. You remember clearly who was there. You remember clearly what present you received. You remember some significant thing that happened there. It's as if you're playing back a videotape, and it's a clear, vivid videotape. Some of our memories are, in fact, accurate and pretty close to being videotaped, but researchers tell us that most of our memories are not. Most of our memories are reconstructed memories, memories that have been changed or distorted so that they're no longer accurate record of the original event. What is particularly fascinating about this is the fact that when we reconstruct memories, we typically don't do it in some random, chaotic fashion. Most of these reconstructed memories are reconstructed in a systematic way. There are certain predictable biases that we show in reconstructing our memories. We typically reconstruct our memories so that they become more consistent with the way that we conceive ourselves, more consistent with the way that we conceive our world. I'll give you an example of a reconstructed memory in the systematic way that it might have been reconstructed. My memory of the space shuttle disaster in 1986. Uh, Most students in my class are too young to have been around when this occurred, but this is a big deal. In 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff. It was a real traumatic experience in the national psyche because there had never been an incident in which astronauts were killed during a mission until then. And it was not very long after the space shuttle taken off, and everybody was watching it rise in the sky, and suddenly there was some flames shooting out part of the rocket, and the rocket exploded. In the accident, everybody on board was killed. Dr. Hatcher, do you remember where you were and what you were doing when the space shuttle exploded in 1986? I might say, yeah, I know exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. It was like yesterday. I was teaching at Winthrop University. It was on a Friday, which is one of the days that I taught 3 sections of general psychology back to back. I even remember what I was lecturing on at that time. I was lecturing on a topic in personality. In between my second class meeting and the beginning of my third class meeting, I went upstairs to check my mail. Back then, we got physical mail in a mailbox. Went upstairs to check my mail, and I ran into one of my students in the hallway, and she said, "Dr. Hatcher, did you hear that the space shuttle blew up?" And I said, "Oh, no, yeah, the space shuttle blew up." We found a TV set and we turned it on and watched the news reports on the space shuttle. And I remember that very clearly. I remember it like it was yesterday. It's a vivid memory. Now, that was my story, but if you looked into my story, if you did some investigating, you might find, Dr. Hatcher, I'm afraid it could not have happened in exactly the way that you said. What do you mean? Well, we looked up records at Winthrop University of what you were teaching at that time, and you were not teaching any sections of general psychology at all. You were teaching 2 sections of statistics and 1 section of industrial psychology. Well, how could that be? But it's so vivid. I remember leaving the class. I remember what I was lecturing on. Maybe what happened was this. The course that I taught more than any other course at Winthrop University was general psychology. I taught many, many sections of it. So if I had a memory that I was in between class meetings, it's logical that the class that I had been teaching was general psychology. Having decided that, my brain might even start filling in some of the blank spaces and telling me, well, you're probably teaching personality, given what time of the semester it was. And so I decided I was teaching personality. I remember exactly what I was lecturing on, which subtopic in personality. It's not that I'm lying, it's that my memory has become reconstructed. I have unconsciously reconstructed the memory to be more consistent with the way that I think of what my life was like back at that time in my life. That's what we mean by reconstructed memory. It's been modified in some systematic way. I changed it to be more consistent with the way that I thought about my life as my life was back then. So, a lot of our forgetting we can attribute to this phenomena of reconstructed memory. We're going to have more to say about this later in this lecture when I talk about false memories and some of the research that's been conducted on that. But the 2 subheadings were supposed to be reconstructed memory and interference. A different factor that contributes to forgetting is something called interference. Let's define interference this way. I'm on page 11, toward the bottom of page 11. Interference goes like this. Experiences that occur either before or after we learn something new may prevent us from successfully retrieving the new information. Old information can interfere with our ability to retrieve new information and vice versa. Give you an example of interference and how I might have difficulty retrieving something that I want to retrieve because of interference. This is another personal example. When I was at Winthrop University, the computer I used was a Macintosh computer. And I'd used it for some years, and I was experienced with Macintosh. I knew how to save files with the Macintosh and how to print and everything. 1996, I came to Saginaw Valley State University, and I saw that just about all the faculty here at SVSU were using Windows, and I decided I should really learn how to use Windows, so I'm using the same operating system as everybody else. It'll be easier to exchange files and that sort of thing. So the university bought a Windows computer for me, and I began the process of teaching myself how to use Windows, and I encountered great difficulty. I encountered great difficulty remembering how to do things with a Windows computer. I had difficulty remembering how do I save a file? What are the keyboard shortcuts that I use to save a file that I'm working at? How do I print a document that I need to print? What are the steps that I go through telling the computer, I want to print this document and I want to print it using the printer in such and such room. I knew how to do all this with a Macintosh, but I had great difficulty remembering how to do it with Windows because everything that I had learned with respect to the Macintosh was getting in the way of me retrieving how to be able to perform that same task using a Windows computer. Same thing would have happened if I had begun with Windows and then later switched to Macintosh. The earlier information would have interfered with my ability to retrieve the later information. Either way, that is interference. Experiences that occur either before or after we learn something new may prevent us from successfully retrieving the new information. Some of our forgetting is due to reconstructed memory. Some of it is due to interference. Some of it is due to decay, as we discussed earlier. And that's still not an exhaustive list of all the factors that can contribute to forgetting. Next up is going to be a video called What is Deja Vu? It's going to be a Vsauce video, but given the time, we don't have time to both set up that video and watch it and talk about it. So I'm going to end my lecture at this point, and we'll pick up with my video next time we get together.